Good evening, library leaders, and welcome to the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club. I'm Brian Hildreth, your moderator for this evening. It's wonderful to have all of you present for what is now our fifth installment of the book club. Tonight, we'll discuss facilities, which is one of 9 trustee responsibilities. Rebecca and Jerry and I have been preparing to guide us through this evening since January's discussions, so I know it'll be a worthwhile time learning and growing together as library leaders. It's nice to see more and more of you joining us this evening. And so we're excited to see more than 100 plus trustees joining us this evening. The purpose of the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club is to provide explanations and insights for more than 6,000 library trustees in New York State. Each book club session takes a deeper dive into one chapter of the trustee handbook and answers real-life questions received from the field that arise in the areas of governance work for library boards. Before we begin, let's quickly get acquainted with each other using the technology that we've been afforded. If you take a look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button as well as a chat button. I'll reference the Q&A feature shortly, but for now, I'd like each of you to introduce yourself to your colleagues by placing your name, your library, and how many years you've been a trustee in the chat box. And I'll say that one more time for those of you that are just joining us. Please share your name, your library, and how many years as a trustee in the chat button. And look at that, we're all getting fantastic at doing this now, 5th time around. As all of you say hello, I'm going to take a moment to introduce 2 of our planning team members. The first individual is Casey Conlin. Casey is the Mid-Hudson Library System Sustainability Coordinator. In addition to helping us prepare for all book club installments, Casey is online with us tonight to help you troubleshoot any technical issues, as well as help us with managing the chat box. The second person is my co-moderator, Ron Kersop, Executive Director of the Pioneer Library System. As it turns out, Ron is not able to join us this evening, but he is an extremely valuable member of our team, and I know he looks forward to joining us next month. Now, let's take a moment to give thanks to our co-promotional sponsors. It is these organizations that continually support libraries and work tirelessly to advance our greater mission for the benefit of all people. Thank you to the New York State Library, the Public Library Systems Director Organization, the Library Trustees Association, the Public Library section of the New York Library Association. We take comfort in knowing these institutions remain steadfast on our behalf. This evening, we're discussing facilities of the Trustee Handbook. As mentioned before, facilities is one of 9 trustee responsibilities, and arguably one of several core public library services. Facilities empower us to bring people together, enhance the work of librarians and staff, provide comfort and safety, and serve as physical symbols of our nation's universities for all community members. We will chisel out 90 minutes to receive an overview of the topic from our handbook's authors, Rebecca and Jerry. They'll also provide answers to frequently asked questions, which were sent in advance by all of our viewers. Following that, I'll moderate the open Q&A by those of you who are attending the live session. When you have questions for Rebecca and Jerry, please place them in the Q&A area by selecting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This is the best place for all questions because it'll allow me to organize them in the same order that they are received. If you have any general comments that you'd like to share with your colleagues, like, can you share a link to that resource just mentioned? Or it's just good to see everyone and be here with everyone, please feel free to put those comments in the chat area by selecting the chat button at the bottom of your screen. I am confident we will receive as many questions this month as we have had in earlier installments. All questions are important, and the more questions, the better. As a reminder, planning team members have been curating all past book discussion content on our website. You can visit www.midhudson.org/trustee book club. And I'm sure Casey's going to put that in the chat just for us in a moment. Library trustees can take comfort in knowing these resources are available through these websites. Now let's get to know our knowledgeable hosts. While most of you already know the authors of our trustee handbook, Rebecca and Jerry, I always think it's important to introduce them because they've done so much important work for all of us. Rebecca Smith Aldrich is the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System. Along with co-authoring the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State, she's also authored the Companion Handbook for New Library Directors in New York State and the Municipal Ballot How-To Guide, as well as 2 books for ALA editions. Jerry Nichols has distinguished himself as a leader in public library services as a library director, library system director, and library educator. He is also considered one of New York State's most authoritative experts in library management, finance, law, and construction. Right now, I'd like to invite Rebecca and Jerry to kick us off with the 5th installment of the Trustee Handbook Book Club. How's it going, guys?
Great. Thank you, Brian. I get to start this evening because I think Rebecca knows that buildings and facilities are where I started in the library world, cleaning bathrooms and driving bookmobiles. So let's start a little philosophically. That the Commissioner's regulations requires you as board members to maintain a facility which meets community needs. Well, I don't think that's good enough. I think that we have a saying among us that a public library articulates the highest ideals of the community it serves. And how you do that is not just by a wonderful service program that's driven by a great collection and wonderful staff, but by having a facility that your community can be proud of. Many of your libraries are community landmarks. And so you have a higher authority, even to those people that never come in your library, but still support you because they're proud of their community and they want to be proud of their library and the landmark that it represents. So let's get off the philosophical soapbox for a second, and let's get down to what your job is. When I get to work with library boards on building projects, the first thing I say to them is, okay, get out of this boardroom, let's go take a walk, go down the street, stand at a corner, take a breath, and now let's go visit the library as if you're going there for the very first time. And I challenge every one of you to do this. Don't go there like you've been there every week for 20 years. Go in there like it's the first time. Look at the street around the library. Look at the sidewalk. Look for those cigarette butts and beer cans that might be laying in the bushes. Walk in the building. What does it feel like? What does it smell like? Not just when you walk in, but in the bathrooms. Do you feel safe? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel like you want to stay there and hang out all day long? Are you proud of the facility? If you can't quickly answer all of those questions yes, you have a lot of work to do. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Rebecca?
So this is where I give props to Jerry as my former professor in the program from Long Island University at the Palmer School on the Advanced Certificate of Public Library Administration. Because when I took the facilities class with Jerry, he talked about this word stewardship that just stuck in my head so firmly, because that really describes the job of the trustee. You've been entrusted with the library facility. Some of you are in different situations. There's certainly a fragment of the library community that is leasing space or renting space, but the majority of boards in New York own their space. But regardless, there's space. And it's a primary contact point with the community of how they are accessing library services. The pandemic certainly challenged our notion of how folks access library services, but the buildings are not going away. People want a place to gather, to access services, to have that serendipitous find on the shelves of your library, to connect them with their next great read. So this concept of stewardship is really important as we think about how you ensure this physical manifestation of your institution reflects the library board's governance competence and your values and the experience that you want people to have in the library for today and long-term for tomorrow. So as we think of the term stewardship, it's not only kind of the day-to-day making sure it's meeting the needs of the community as is said in the commissioner's regulations, but it's also that foresight that you need to have about what's changing in the world today and ensuring that the facility that the library is living in meets the needs of the community truly. We've certainly had a lot of our libraries in New York be housed in historic properties, and that's something very prevalent in my area of New York State. We have probably, I'm going to say, close to 50% of our libraries are in buildings that are about 50 years old, but 30% are in buildings that are 100 years old, right? So we're getting into the historic preservation nature of some facilities. We always have to remember we're not in the historic preservation building business. We are in the library business. So making sure we right size our planning in our facilities and have honest conversations about if facilities are actually meeting the needs of people in the year 2022. So we're going to take a look here now at what are the, kind of basic foundational things to be considering as you maintain a building that meets the community's needs.
So most of us think of accessibility as complying with the American Disability Act, which has been around for, I think, 27 years now. And we're still working at it. But I submit to you that it's far more than that. Yes, you need to meet ADA standards, but it's up to you to be far more proactive than that. Accessibility in libraries is not just about wheelchair ramps. It's about making everyone feel comfortable. It's about making everyone feel welcome, regardless of their disability, perhaps. And let's broaden that term of disability, because one of my pet peeves is I love, many libraries have, I'll get specific here, you sell bricks with people's names on them. That's wonderful. Try going over those bricks in a walker. And having had, I'm not there yet, but having had many relatives that had needed walkers, that's putting an obstacle in their way. You need to think about little things like that insofar as physical access, but you also need to think about things in personal access. Does someone feel comfortable coming in? Can you provide them with information in the language that they're comfortable with? Can you provide them with information that they can see or hear if they need that? So I suggest that you consider accessibility in a much broader fashion, much more proactive fashion, and understand that it's one of your roles in the library to be a leader in your community, to go the extra step, to show the way and be a model for any number of things about serving your community and serving the people that, frankly, support you. Rebecca?
I think in the area of accessibility, it's often easy to think of the world through our own lens of how we operate in buildings and how we think of our experience in a facility. But we need to put on different personas and think through, what is life like for someone who's differently able? What is life like for someone whose English is not their first language? What if they don't drive a car? Just thinking about that experience, as Jerry talked about, walking up and pretending you're a new patron, it can't just be from your own personal viewpoint. We need to think about those different experiences of people in our communities that have the right to access library services in an equitable fashion. So you can see our little icons here. We're talking about public transportation and access to technology and signage that reflects community and the way folks use your building. It's easy to forget that not everyone is like ourselves. Sometimes our boards are a bit homogeneous, and we need to force ourselves out of that comfort zone and really actually do an exercise where you are scenario planning using different personas of what would it be like to walk through this building or to roll through this building using an assistive device. And is that experience just as good for one person as it is another? So it's almost like I don't want to say it's a fun exercise, but if facilitated right, it could be a fun exercise. But we encourage you to think differently about how people roll through your building or walk through your building. So this idea of someone having a good experience in your building, that's a customer service aspect, just as it is, a legal aspect when it comes to the Americans with Disabilities Act. But we also have issues of health and safety as a workplace for the folks that we hire to work in our library spaces. So attention to detail of that experience as well. We're often focused on patron experiences, which is fantastic because that's what we're supposed to do and we're supposed to build towards. But if our workplace is not healthy and safe as well, we're not necessarily holding up our values as a good steward of what's being entrusted to us as library trustees and library leaders. So I just put a few of these things before you in the considerations of library facilities. Lighting issues for appropriate workspaces. It's not one size fits all when it comes to lighting in libraries. And that's something that we've learned along the way as we've helped design new buildings throughout the Hudson Valley. What a staff person may need to do work on a computer is not necessarily what the children's room needs to do children's programming. Lines of sight, the staff feels safe that they can see entrances. Can they see where folks are moving throughout the building? Can staff see each other so they can communicate in nonverbal ways? The air quality of the building. When Jerry mentioned the smell, I'm thinking back to the class that Jerry taught on facilities when I was enrolled in that program. And he said this line that is stuck in my head to this day, that library votes are won and lost in library bathrooms. And my mind went someplace completely different than what he meant, which was just the care that we take, the smell, the impression that we're leaving. The buildings themselves are a non-verbal clue as to how well the library is run, where money is invested, and how we care for the people that work and attend services in our facilities. So a number of the things on this slide are related to that aspect of a safe workplace, but also a healthy one. Emergency action planning and training for your staff so they understand what to do in the unfortunate events that sometimes happen in public spaces. Are these things that are routinely built in to how we run our libraries? Now, this is something your director takes the lead on, certainly, but you'll want to ensure that's actually happening from a risk management standpoint to ensure you have a healthy workspace.
You're so articulate. Rebecca, I can concur with everything you said. I just want to resonate one comment. To all of you trustees, do not cheap out safety for your staff. If they're worried about leaving the building at 9 o'clock at night and there are lights out in the parking lot, they're not going to do a good job while they're in the building. If they're concerned about some odd people coming in the building and they're a little nervous, they're not going to do their best job. And many times where I know you have to worry about budgets and spending, but you cannot cheap out making or allowing your staff to feel safe. Don't need to say anything more than that. Please keep that in mind. If you wouldn't feel safe there at 9 o'clock at night, why would you think they would?
So we wanted to start by focusing on kind of the micro aspects of a healthy and safe workspace, but there's larger considerations as you consider the future of your facilities and how you'll make decisions about how it's operated or perhaps renovated or expanded, or even when you're building a new building. And that's the issue of sustainability, which is actually a health issue. I'm not sure if everyone picked up on this. I'm certainly someone who pays attention to this, but in September, something unprecedented happened. Over 200 of the leading medical journals across the globe issued the same statement on the same day, talking about the fact that climate change is the greatest threat to global public health. So we might think of the immediate, the air quality in our buildings, but I can't lose sight of the long-term issues related to air quality and breathability of air in our world. So as we think about the future of our facilities, we have to incorporate sustainability into the lens we use of how we operate our buildings, how we renovate our buildings, and how we're building new buildings. To consider energy consumption issues, where are resources coming to run our facilities? Are we doing the best we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Are we respecting where natural resources are coming from to build new buildings? And are we making decisions using this ethical framework of sustainability, the triple bottom line of sustainability? Is it ethical when it comes to the environmental resources we're using? Is it fair to the people who not only work and use that building, but live in the areas where resources come from to build our facilities? And is it economically feasible? We have a responsibility to balance these three things. We can't build the greenest possible building that costs $40 billion. We don't have that kind of money. Our taxpayers can't afford that type of building. So we have to find balance in the decisions we're making in the future, but keeping not only the individual worker and library patrons' health in mind, but the global public health problem of climate change has to be incorporated into our thinking as well. As Jerry said, we need to be leaders in our communities, not only on accessibility and technology, but on the topic of sustainability as well. If you're looking for more information on this topic, the Sustainable Libraries Initiative is a great place to start. If you're looking to be more methodical about how you move forward in a sustainable way, they also have an award-winning Sustainable Library Certification program to help guide choices about operations, landscaping, renewable energy, programming, collections, community resilience. It's a very big and possibly overwhelming topic, and the Sustainable Libraries Initiative is there to make it more manageable for you. So I encourage you to check that out.
And let me just compliment my young colleague for being not only the national, but the international leader in library sustainability. Thank you, Rebecca.
My pleasure.
Oh, this is mine. I love capital financing. Folks, everyone says, okay, how are we going to pay for this? Well, we've gone over this in the handbook. It's pretty straightforward. First of all, you need to set aside money in order to maintain a good facility. You need to set aside money in order to change that facility and grow that facility to meet the needs of your community. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. And first of all, most folks put some money away in their annual budget to maintain the library, but you can also put some money away for long-term capital. You should save that in a capital reserve fund. We talked about finance last month. And you you must have a capital reserve fund separate from your operating funds. And if you have any money left over at the end of the year, or somebody gives you a nice gift, that's where you put that money, because you're going to need a new roof, you're going to need a new air conditioner, and someday you're going to need a new building. So build that capital reserve fund. Often that's not going to be enough to take care of very large projects. So there are bondings and grants, and you can do capital campaigns, of course, each of which we will probably be dealing with a little more in detail in another session. But these are different ways to do it. They're all covered to some very short extent in the trustee handbook, but your system, and there are library consultants that can help you with this, and fiscal advisors. There's a lot of different ways for you to afford to do that building that you might be reluctant to do. But in most cases, you're going to need your community support. But meanwhile, you need to plan ahead. And there's many ways that you can be planning ahead. We're going to get to that really in the next slide. Okay, first of all, every one of you, if you haven't already, should get an engineering review of your existing facility. Now, this is smart from a construction point of view and from a maintenance point of view, but also those of you who get audited by the state controller's office, the public libraries, those auditors are going to come in and they're going to say, okay, I see you have a capital reserve fund. What's it there for? And you need to provide them with an engineering review that tells them what you need this money for. There are many engineering firms that are more than happy to do this. It will give you a to-do list for the next several years of how to maintain your building, how much it's going to cost, and really to give you the basic fundamental start and foundation for maintaining your building and perhaps someday expanding your building. If you think you need more space, you need to talk to your community. And not only do you talk to your community, you need to assess it yourself. It's one of the quick things about community assessments and having, groups come in to tell you about what they want. It's like saying, okay, do you want a chocolate or a vanilla ice cream or both? You as a board have a responsibility to crystallize what the community's needs are. And what's important about assessing the community's needs, are they changing? This is, again, part of your long-range planning. It's an essential step. I think it's step number 2 or 3 in the one that we recommend in the handbook. But if you're going to design a building, it needs to be draped over your service program. And you don't know what your service program is unless you know what your community needs. So let's get past that point. And if you want to do something insofar as a large building project or a renovation, you need to build a team. None of us are expert enough to do this on our own. You as trustees have been entrusted with a building, and now you've been entrusted to hire professionals to help you. Now, who are the professionals? Well, first of all, you need a good attorney. You need an attorney that understands construction contracts, maybe understands bonding. Not an attorney who's frankly the son of the original attorney that was with the library 75 years ago, but someone who's got an area of expertise. So you might actually ask your attorney, if you have a favorite local one, do you have somebody you can recommend to help us with a building project? Next, of course, you need your insurance person. And sometimes using your friendly local insurance agent is not enough. You might need an insurance agent that not only understands your library liability, but deals with contractors. And there are many insurance companies out there that do that, because if you enter into any kind of agreement, you need insurance, and you need an expert to look at the insurance and understand whether they're meeting the requirements that you've specified and whether you as the institution are covered. you're going to need a fiscal advisor. If you're going to do bonding and borrow a great amount of money, there are some companies in the state of New York, very reputable, and for a very reasonable amount of money, they will serve as your fiscal advisor to help you put together bond issues should you go that way, or perhaps even deal with a bank for mortgaging. Again, we will deal with this a little further in another segment, I'm sure. Of course, you need an architect. And I suggest that you hire the architect pretty early on, but go through a process. Do not hire the local guy who wants a chance to do something nice for the community. Hire a firm that has done libraries before. You don't need to spend your time and your money teaching someone how to build a library. It's much better to draw on architectural firms that have had library experience, about whom you can call a neighbor and say, how did they do for you? And when things went south, which they will, you will have problems. How did they handle the problems? How did they handle their mistakes? How did they deal with contractors? And then finally, of course, we strongly recommend that you hire a construction management firm. Yes, it will take time, but they are professionals at dealing with construction projects. None of this is free. And again, we'll spend a little more time on this in a future presentation to go on over some details on that. But my point is, of course, you need a team. And all of this falls back into what your long-range plan is. And by now you must know that you're going to have a new long-range plan up on your website 10 months from now, 9 months from now, I guess, Rebecca. The state gave everybody a break this year, I think. So anyway, Rebecca, what have you got to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to expand on a point you made early on when you were talking about the engineering review and how it's tied to the justification for your reserve fund, your capital reserve fund. I would say that when OSC comes knocking, asking for that justification, it's not just about that engineering review to adjust major systems of your building. You're also going to want to have a facility plan that captures other aspects of usability of the building. So, for example, an accessibility assessment. We're going to share a resource with you that's a checklist against the Americans with Disabilities Act to really walk through the building and make sure it's meeting needs. And that might feed into construction plans, renovation plans, furniture purchasing plans that need to adjust how the building is laid out. You could address energy conservation issues that you've identified through one of the nice Certa Flex Tech assessments you can get for free through the state. So, I think your facilities plan should address not just the big renovation and expansion projects, but also the fine tuning you're doing of your building on accessibility, energy conservation, technology, furniture, how this building is laid out. There's lots of things that can be fixed to improve the user experience with your existing footprint before exploring renovation and expansion at the larger dollar level. So I'd encourage you, and I think there's a resource, at least in the Trustee Handbook that we developed here at Mid-Hudson, super simple outline for a facility plan that you could start yourselves as a board or a committee of the board to just start to all the things that have been kind of floating around in conversations that need to be addressed with the library, that we start to capture those in writing. There's lots of things about your facility that are predictable. There are ends to useful life of mechanics, ends of useful life to a roof. We all know when the parking lot probably needs to be resealed or probably resurfaced. These are predictable expenses that you could pull out of your capital fund if they're well thought through and documented and board approved. So facility plans can be, simple. That outline I mentioned, they can be involved when you're pulling in engineers to do reports for you, but you've got to have something in writing that justifies that capital reserve fund. So again, quick tool is available to you today. You may need to hire professionals to help you with a larger assessment of that building.
And Rebecca, I'd like to jump back a previous slide on capital funding. Put a little plug in. Rebecca and I actually just redid the New York State Division of Library Development had what was called a Public Library District Toolkit. Rebecca and I rewrote that completely and greatly expanded that to call we call it Strategies for Public Library Legal and Financial Stability. It is on the website. I think Casey will probably post that. There it is. It is far beyond the original toolkit that said how to tells you how to change your structure. I think most of you will find it enlightening. If you have any financial or legal problems with the management of your library, so we suggest you take a look at it. I don't think it's been publicized yet by the state, but it's online. So we invite you to take a look at it and contact us if you have any questions.
So when Jerry and I were putting together this slide on capital financing, we both were like, uh-oh, they're going to have a lot of questions about this and about construction projects. And, you know, we could do a whole session just on construction and renovation. So guess what, folks? In the fall, we're going to do a session just on construction and renovation. So we can take a much deeper dive with some practitioners here in New York State who have gone through projects, who can share their expertise and kind of fill in the real life experiences of passing a bond, dealing with a construction management firm, and doing that type of work. So, you know, tonight we're happy to address questions that you'll have in these areas, but we also just wanted to let you know we're going to have a planned event that goes a little deeper on these issues, where you'll get to hear from probably more interesting people than Jerry and I on the topic even.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, Rebecca, but we'll let other people get a few words in edgewise.
So, Jerry, if you're cool, I'm going to pull down the PowerPoint presentation and let Brian moderate from here on out.
Yeah, let's give it back to Brian.
Okay.
Hey, thanks for sharing all of your oversight and our insight and overview of the topic, guys. We really appreciate it. And we've had some really good comments popping up in the chat. We've also got some questions coming in for the live section. And I just want to remind our participants to start putting your questions in that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We've got some going right now, which is great, and we'll get to them in a little bit. But what we are going to do at this moment is actually segue into our pre-submitted questions that came in since our January session. And so Rebecca and Jerry have had an opportunity to take a look at these questions. Not that they had to do much research, because they probably already had the answers to them once they were received, but I'm going to turn it over to these guys now to kind of work through some of these pre-submitted questions. So guys, our first question is, our library is just starting to plan this, or is just starting the planning stages of a new building addition. It'll more than double our existing footprint. How much or how often do we involve community members in planning? Can you provide some effective ways we can do this? And I think you just touched upon that a little bit in that construction slide. So,
well, I'll start, because Rebecca and I both we ended up having the same kind of take on this. And there's a lot of right ways to do this. But first of all, let's agree the board has the ultimate responsibility. It's a lot of fun to bring the community in and understand that you're going to get community members who want a bigger library. And they might, again, want chocolate and vanilla ice cream cones. So you need to understand and know your community does the entire community want this? That's a question Rebecca immediately says, does your community want this? That's going to make a big difference. Are you going to have to do a hard sell, or is it time and everyone understands that? So let me just jump in. There's a lot of right ways to do this. You obviously can do surveys. There's lots of them out there asking people, you know, what kind of services do you want? Because remember, you're going to design the building around the services. You need to understand the demographics and the changes in demographics in your community. You obviously should keep an ongoing communication with the community. There's no secrets in this world, remember. So use your website to let people know what you're talking about, what you're thinking about, because you are going to generate interest anyway, not just from the people on your side, hopefully, but from the people that say, what the hell do we need a new library? I have Google. Obviously, you're going to have public meetings during a design process. One of the more dramatic and design processes is called a charrette. It's a design meeting where you invite the community in, and the architects are there, and some of them are very skilled at this. They're actually going to build they're going to design a library in front of the community. And then they'll go in the back room and make a little model and bring it out again. It's a lot of fun. But ultimately, I'm going to go back to what Rebecca said, and you're more than welcome to jump in on this. Does your community agree with this, or is this going to be a hard sell? And I think that you want to elaborate on that, Rebecca, a little bit.
I do think the starting point of the project matters when it comes to community input, the frequency, the type of community input that you're getting. So I think it depends on how recently you created your strategic plan, how frequently you are, how recently you had spoken to the community about their goals and aspirations for the future. Do you have the community members approaching you saying, why aren't you doing something about this building?
Yeah.
Because then your process is expedited. But if it's the grand idea of the board, and the community is very unaware of it or sees no obvious problem with the building if they're, regular users and they waltz in, get a book, waltz out. And it's really just being driven by vision internally amongst the governance and management leaders of the library. There's a trajectory that you're building towards, right? You're not just building a building, you're building community and financial support for the project that you're creating. So, depending on your type of library, you're either working towards passing a bond vote or you're starting a capital campaign to get people to invest private dollars, possibly both. So we need to be really strategic in those input phases. So again, judging how far out you were from your strategic planning input will influence this. When you get into the design phase, your architects usually love the component of the charrette and inviting people to comment on what they've come up with, but you don't want that community input phase before the library board has identified the top level priorities for the project in terms of accessibility, sustainable goals, what the ultimate program of that space needs to be before folks start reacting to a design. Because what you're going to do is you're going to lose, the center will not hold in that kind of situation if the board and the staff and the design team have not agreed to the philosophies and the principles behind the reason for doing this project. So if you leap right to design and hop right over in the model called levels of thought, looking at Matthew Bollerman, who might be on the line here tonight, who introduced this topic to us. There's a business consultant called Carol Sanford, and she talks about building sustainable businesses. And this applies in construction projects so perfectly that if you have not agreed on why you are doing this project and what the ultimate outcome needs to be, when you get into the design process and the little pieces of the project about where something might be located or what color something's going to be, things will fall apart. So taking not only the time to get the community input, but getting your philosophy and your principles straight for the project is just as important as you move towards your goal, whatever it might be, true community input on design or building support for that bond vote and capital campaign, which, let's be honest, you're not going to get very far without that.
Why I get a kick out of it from this one simple question. You and I are both using this as a foundation to really give a philosophy on approaching building projects. And I thank you very much. Rebecca, this goes back to really what I said in the very beginning. The board, you are responsible. And you're either elected or you've been appointed and you've been entrusted with making a good decision here. And sometimes you want to hear what you want to hear. Your job is to hear everything, especially that which you don't want to hear. And all too often I've seen building projects fail because they were convinced by the people that really wanted to build the Taj Mahal that we can get this done. And yet their common sense of saying, that's a little too much. Let's scale this back a little bit so we know we're going to get it. In other words, is B+ good enough? That's your judgment. And I've often seen library projects fail the first time out, and then the board goes back and said, they just cut it a little bit. And the community said, okay, thank you very much. You paid attention. And it goes through. So please don't underestimate your responsibility. Don't abdicate it to people in the community that want to build the perfect library, or to the architect, for God forbid, please. They want to build the perfect library. So that's a theme that we'll come back to in another session at some point in time. But
Jerry, I like that.
But keep the community involved no matter what. So
I like how you differentiated, Jerry, at the top of this question about the difference between involving folks and giving input on design versus keeping them in the loop about what's going on. That sometimes is way more important than getting input specifically on the design, because you've got the folks in-house that can give you the input on the design once you've got it. But if you don't keep your folks in the loop in the community, so they understand what's happening at what pace and what to expect next and where the opportunities for input are, that can be far more damaging than not getting input on the specifics of the design.
agreed.
I'm going to read a comment from William for you guys. He says, it's also very important to explain how the capital plan links directly to the library strategic plan. Now, I know you guys have gotten a lot more in depth, but it's nice to learn from both of you, but it's also nice to know that our trustees also have that knowledge that like one assumes that that strategic plan is based on community feedback and going through that process of really soliciting that information from community members so that the library facility is in true alignment of not only library services, but what it is that the community wants from the library, not so much what the community thinks the library wants from them. So I think that's really great. So we're going to kind of
let me add a little bit to that.
Sure.
Rebecca and I redid the trustee handbook back in 2018 because the state was finally updating the minimum standards. And the biggest change was in integrating strategic planning in every step of your standards. And the reason that we also updated the whole concept of financial and legal stability was because every one of you is supposed to be going through this strategic planning process. And if you're, let's just say, a village library and you've been cut relentlessly over the last 10 years, it's time for you to plan a new future. And the same is true if your building is falling apart. It's time for you to plan a new future. So William's comment absolutely rings true. This is the time, if you haven't already, your new strategic plan that you're developing right now should be calling for financial stability, legal stability, and a facility that will meet the needs of your community for the next decade or two.
Thanks, Jerry. So we're going to pivot here. This is more of a technical or legal question and moving away from the theoretical and high level stuff, but are association libraries held to public bidding requirements and prevailing wage rates for capital projects?
Well, we have two answers to this. I have one, Rebecca's got another. No, unless you're using state construction aid, in which case you're probably smart enough to be able to divide that part of the project out and fund it separately. Or if you're financing through a community development corporation, you're not a public institution. However, I'll defer to Rebecca to summarize her official answer that she sent me in blue earlier this evening.
I just want to be clear that everyone heard the question. This was specific to association libraries. And your compliance with public bidding and prevailing wage. And so I think one of the easiest ways to think about this is where is the money coming from to build the project? Because that's probably going to be where you find your answer. There is no blanket requirement for association libraries to follow public bidding or prevailing wage, but sometimes funds you receive from the state can come with that string attached to it. So I would say just be careful, understand from your funder what the expectation is, and be very, very careful, because if you do not respect that, you will be crucified by the unions in the community. And that is nothing we want to see a library deal with. I know some of the people, I'm looking at who's on the line tonight. I know some of you have gotten the rat. You've gotten the inflatable rat outside the library building. That's never good press for any of us. So don't mess that one up.
Those of you who don't know what the rat is, the certain unions rent a rat if you're not having a non-union job or you're not doing prevailing wages or whatnot. And my favorite story about that, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to tell stories, but one of our libraries, when the rat showed up, the children's librarian and director, they had a showing of Willard the rat for the children, and they went outside and told stories about rats in front of the rat. And the local paper had an interview with the rat. They just made so much fun of the whole thing that it turned out to be a wonderful family story for that local library. And eventually the union gave up and said, okay, we've met our match. We can't fight children's librarians.
How would you suggest a board work with architects and their engineers on an existing condition study when members of the board and the director are not very knowledgeable of what is in the study? We just don't have a lot of experience in this area. So I like this question a lot. I get this question a lot from trustees.
Well, that's why you hire experts. Rule number one, if you first of all, you should be contacting engineering firms or asking your system if they have recommendations. Other libraries have used engineering firms. Get a couple of proposals. You might not need a bid. They're consultants, so there doesn't have to be a formal bidding process. and compare and contrast. It's not brain, it's not brain surgery. Some architectural firms do offer it. I would get an independent engineering firm to do it, and not just a personal preference. I'd rather have a separate engineering firm do the engineering report rather than an architect that you're going to end up hiring to fix the problems, do the report. But there's a lot of examples out there. You've got plenty of people to copy. Don't go it alone. You've got, again, call your system.
I think of this one almost as thinking back to our finance session about separation of duties, that you need basically an owner's rep. You need someone who is knowledgeable and is going to advise you in the face of working with consultants and professionals in the construction field. And you may have someone like that on your board. More likely than not, you don't, though. So to Jerry's point, the money you would invest in having someone come in and consult with you on this topic, that their only job is to protect you and to make sure you make good choices on this topic, will save you so much money in the long run. So I know I hear you already. You're balking at, I don't want to pay that person, but they're going to save you a lot of money in the long term and help you make really solid decisions moving forward that will ultimately probably save you more than you ever spent on their services.
Yeah, and I think it ties back to the justification that you talked about earlier in the evening when you talked about capital reserves. And, if you've got that money in the bank, having that engineering study or that review in hand really justifies why that money's there, and that you have, whether it's a capital policy or, you have that justification in hand as to why you're going to move forward and spend these funds. But I agree, spending the money in the right places and making sure you have those professionals working on your behalf to make sure you're making good, sound decisions is the good place to start.
And let me just say, an engineering study is not a major project.
Right.
Almost every engineering firm does it these days. It's pretty standard. The equipment is the equipment. It's got a useful life, as Rebecca, and I think Rebecca even is sending out has a thing about what useful life is. It's not. Again, it's not rocket science or brain surgery. It's something that they do, but you need a professional to do it. That's all. And there are a lot of good companies out there. I wouldn't be afraid of that. I'd spend, once it's done, you got a piece of paper. And then it goes to who you're going to get to do the work. So that's another project.
I'm hoping Brian's motion detector just like fritzed out and he didn't.
Yeah, I know his lights went off, right?
We've been having issues with power today for some reason. I assure you I'll get it on before the evening ends.
As long as you don't lose
there
it.
There it goes. Yeah. So we've got another question from association libraries and municipal libraries. I assure you we're going to get to you tonight. How do association libraries become eligible for public bonding on capital projects? And can you discuss the minimum project thresholds for New York State bonding requirements?
I'll take this because this is kind of one of my fields. First of all, you're not eligible in many of the standard ways. And one of the reasons we created the avenue to go through the New York State Dormitory Authority was to allow association libraries by legislation become eligible to use DASNY to do their funding for them, to do their bonding for them. There's another avenue that association libraries can use, which is community development corporations. There are not, they used to go through industrial development agencies, but that was disallowed a few years ago when they stopped allowing them to do civic improvement bonds. But if you have a community development corporation in your area, you can do that. Now, here's your caveat. These things cost money and they will charge you. And that's the way it is. So the question is, there is no threshold for bonds. The question is it worth it? And in dealing with DASNY, my old thing, since we started the whole DASNY project in my system with several libraries, I used to tell libraries under 3 million, go to a bank. It's not worth it. And this is back when interest was a lot more than it is now. Nowadays, it's under 5 million, go to a bank. Maybe more. If you're an association library and you're looking for several $1 million, go call on your local banks, folks, and see what kind of deal you can make before you worry about bonds. If you're looking for 10, 20, 15, $10, $15 million, okay, you should already be contacting the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York, DASNY, They have a nice little group that'll help with libraries that does both financing and construction management. Personal opinion, do not hire them for construction management. They can overcharge the state. You don't want them to overcharge you. The bonding works very well. And one of the other things that you can do, and Rebecca mentioned Matt Boleman before, when he was a director of an association library some years ago, he packaged several libraries together to make it a large enough bond to make it worthwhile for them to finance through the dormitory authority, which was really a nice move. And of course, those of you who get New York State construction grants every year understand that the Division of Library Development uses that strategy every year. None of our construction projects are enough to warrant DASNY bonding, but when you roll the whatever it is together, 17, 14, $25 million together, then you get their attention. So there's some ways to do it, but check with your local banks first to see what kind of interest you get.
All right, 2 more pre-submitted questions, and we've got more live questions coming in, and we want to make sure that we get to those this evening. Is there a rule of thumb for how much we should allocate of our budget towards maintaining our building, not including things like utilities or seasonal upkeep? So money for actual maintenance, repair, and projects. Is there any scientific formula out there?
No, I'm so sorry, there's not. But there's not. I think it's, your buildings vary so much, and the needs of those buildings vary so much that it's hard to apply a formula across the board on something like this. But this goes back to the whole assessment phase of, facility committee's work to really understand that building inside and out, to have a preventative maintenance schedule involved with your major systems, making sure it's clear who's in charge of that preventative maintenance schedule. I'll tell one of my stories, Jerry. I was at Jerry and I may have like a contest lifetime of who's been to the most board meetings, but so I sit through a lot of board meetings. I was at this tiny rural libraries board meeting, and I was probably number 7 on the agenda. They were going to talk to me about a capital campaign. So I'm sitting through all the committee reports and the financial reports, and we get to the board president's report, and he noted how they had just had the boiler serviced, and how that was something the director takes care of every year. He's trying to inform the board about the preventative maintenance schedule. And she said, well, excuse me, actually, you do that. I've never done that. And he's like, no, you do that. I've never done that. And so someone runs downstairs and looks at the service tag on the boiler, and it hadn't been touched in close to a decade, which is just like an explosion waiting to happen, honestly. So, when we think about how much things cost in the long term, good preventative maintenance will reduce your long-term costs of maintaining that building. So while there's not a formula involved, there's a lot of common sense involved, just as you take care of your home. If you own your own home, you understand how to do that, applying some of that same thinking to your building to overall keeping those costs down. But I'd say that there's probably like a little study that you have to do internally of what you've been paying historically to project what you might need in the future. If you combine that information with that simple facility outline we talked about to start averaging out your costs on an annual basis, yeah, it's definitely homework, but you can figure it out.
One of the questions that I think we have another question somewhere along the line about using, maintenance staff of your own and exterior, and external maintenance staff. Frankly, for some of your more sophisticated operations, you need service contracts. Pay the money, because as long as they're going to show up on a Saturday night in the middle of a snowstorm when the heat goes, that's what you're paying for. And again, like Rebecca said, you want to do what you do for your own home. I disagree. You want to do better than you do for your own home, because sometimes we don't have enough money to do it right at home, but this is not your home. This is your community's home. So don't cheap it out. And again, get that engineering study. It's going to help you a lot, because it's going to literally just give you a list of all of the things that you need to worry about. And any engineering firm will give that to you. I mean, it's that important, and it's that simple, and it's something that'll help you plan a lot for the future. But as to rule of thumb, it used to be 20%, but that's thrown away years ago. Don't quote me on that anymore.
The handbook references being LEED certified and pursuing achievable levels of sustainability. We want to do our part, but our community's finances are too limited to meet many of these requirements. How can we strike that balance? And
I
this will be our
defer
last.
to the expert, Rebecca.
I'm taking this one. All right. So we definitely talked about certification, third-party certification programs that are available when you're doing a major renovation or expansion project. And third-party verification does just that. It makes sure that your design professionals, your engineering professionals, your construction professionals actually built your building to spec, and that they had goals in mind to do so. So LEED is an acronym for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's one of several models you can use to help guide the priority that you have set, I hope, for major construction projects that you may oversee, to make sure your building is as healthy as possible, as sustainable as possible. So you can definitely, just like they talk about products on the shelf of your grocery store being greenwashed, where it might say, oh, we're green. It's like, well, are you saying that, or does someone verify that you're actually green? These are basically products that verify your building has been built into the specifications necessary to maximize energy efficiency, water efficiency, great indoor air quality. It provides that insights as well as comfort that you understand it was done properly. So I would say that while we are referencing that as a tool for you, you need to make sure you have found design professionals that specialize in that to do it effectively and cost effectively. So you will definitely hear a lot of mythology around sustainable design with folks saying, oh, it costs so much, we just can't do it, can't afford to be LEED certified. Well, let me tell you, the federal government does not build a building anymore that is not LEED certified. And they've done study after study after study that has proven it does not cost any more to build a LEED certified building than it does to use traditional construction methodologies. What really matters, though, is having professionals that are educated in this, who believe you when you say this is a priority, and they carry this through. Is there a cost associated with certification? Absolutely. If you've got the right professionals with the right design professionals on staff who have a LEED AP on staff, they will make that part and parcel of the cost of doing your project. So I think, A, are you tapped into the right professionals who understand what they're doing? Because if you are, it should not cost anymore. But B, are you sure you've prioritized this in your communication to your design professionals? So as you think about a building program, when you're doing an RFP for an architect or a design firm or an engineering firm, this has to be clearly stated that this is a board priority, that the building is as sustainable as possible, with very specific, things that you say about, we want to build an energy efficient building, or as many buildings out west are now doing, we want to build net zero energy buildings. This is actually a requirement for some buildings on the West Coast. So being knowledgeable about the topic, clearly stating it as a priority. Could you do a built to LEED specs building and get a better building than you would otherwise? Absolutely. Are we going to shame you for that? Absolutely not. This is a spectrum. You're trying to do your best. If you truly don't have professionals in your region of the state that specialize in this, that's okay. Do your best. Maybe get involved with the Sustainable Library Certification Program, which helps you think this through long term. So you build into your facility plans some of the language and goals you need to get there, which will buy you more time to find the right professionals to help you with that, instead of it kind of like dawning on you during the interview with the architect. Or maybe what I've seen happen a lot is after you've hired the architect and you're midway through the building, and then you're like, oh, let's do geothermal. Wouldn't that be a great idea? And then you just added like, I don't know, $250,000 to your project after it's already the value engineered. So I'm a big proponent of integrated building design. I believe all your stakeholders should be on the same page at the beginning of your project with the goals clearly stated, which will minimize the cost of your project. That means the board has to have their goals clearly articulated, which if you can't tell, I think sustainability should be a very top level goal you have for your project. But again, find the right professionals. They will save you the money at the end of the day.
One last comment on that, Rebecca. Thank you. You've spoken like a true construction manager. Libraries are educational institutions. And we don't just educate passively by having books and videos or whatever. We educate by modeling and showing our community good behavior and spending the time and the effort and the thought and the consideration and the planning and the community involvement to show them a good way to do things that will help our society and our country and our world. That's kind of your job description. So please do.
I know I just mentioned the Sustainable Libraries Initiative, but really the vision of that project is that libraries should be leaders on the topic of sustainability. Library building should be the most sustainable building in the community, just like we set the goal for ourselves that we'd be the most technologically savvy institutions in our communities maybe 2 or 3 decades ago. So this is the new challenge. This is the new grand challenge that we all have, is to think differently about our facilities, how we operate them, how we build them, how we maintain our grounds. This is the new challenge of our day. So I hope you embrace it and learn more about it.
Thank you, Rebecca. So we're going to move into live questions now. And our first question comes from Maggie. Maggie wants to know, we rent our space in a building. There's only so far we can go with a fresh coat of paint and new rugs and a small unexpendable spaces without spending significant dollars on somebody else's building. We're open to suggestions. So I know that's not so much a question, but we haven't talked about lease spaces so much yet. So can you give up any advice for Maggie?
Well, I wonder if you're telling us you've identified that space no longer meets your needs. And so I think I hear in that question that was asked. So the next thing I would say is, remember that attorney that Jerry mentioned should be on your team, reading that lease and finding out how you get out of it and move on.
And third, that strategic plan of yours should be addressing this. If it's not, if the facility is not adequate, look at that, and then look at that link that I think Casey just sent up about strategies for financial and legal stability. Libraries deserve to own their own place. That's, if you can do it, do it.
All right, so the next question, you guys talk about it in the handbook. It comes from Meg, and she wants to know, how does one conduct a code atom drill?
I think we have a link to that website. Google it, and they'll send you a free, there used to be a free DVD on how to do the training. I'm assuming it's still an active thing. I actually, it's pretty simple, but it's something that you or your children's librarian might want to take on as a little project. Please look at the Code Atom website, and it'll teach you how. Real simple, a lot of fun. Rebecca might remember in class, I actually had a one of the students did it as a class project and videoed it with a child that was their lead actor. It was kind of fun, but it's worth doing. And bottom line with any of these things for training, you train fire drills, you train Code Atom, you train active shooter with the hope that you're never going to need it. But if you don't train it, and you do need it, you just, it's your fault. You're liable for it. So please do it.
I always think of it as Murphy's Law, right? If you do the training, hopefully you never need it. But if you didn't do the training, it's probably going to happen.
Yeah, and I would say just some additional comments on that too, as somebody that, has to train that with our own staff. It's all about muscle memory. And, sometimes as directors, we get intimidated of trying to develop that curriculum or going through that process, thinking that as a director or administrator, we have to have the answers to all those questions. You employ amazing people. And so just having a space and time where people can come together and talk through how you deal with those situations, whether it's any of the situations both Rebecca and Jerry mentioned, your staff are going to bring up some amazing ideas that you're not even thinking about yet, and you'll all figure it out together. And then when you go through that process of practicing it, like you said, we're hoping to avoid that situation. But if you ever have to go through it, hopefully those muscles just kick into action and do all the right things that need to be done.
Rebecca might remember in class, there's a rather thorough study. Hopefully you'll never have this again, but those of you who fly, when in airplane crashes where there were survivors, if you got on the plane and you were a person who personally looked at the exit that you would take in an emergency, you increased your survival rate tenfold. If you didn't look, you were a problem. You had a problem. If you just looked once, as Brian said, it was imprinted and you knew where to go, and it made all the difference in survival. And the same is true in any of these drills.
So next question comes from Christine. We're housed in a 100-plus-year-old train station with a failing slate roof. It's not registered as a historic site, but it is a historic district. Who can tell us if the replacement roof must be slate, which increases the cost of the roof beyond our entire annual budget? So it's not registered as a historic site, but it's in a historic district. But I'm assuming they've got to get through some SHPO if they want to use construction aid on that, right?
They want construction aid, you got to go through SHPO, and you got a problem. SHPO, the state historic preservation folks come into play, what if it's 50 years old? And many of us have had banged heads with them about even restoring a building to what it was before 50 years ago, and they didn't want to do it. So chances are you're going to have to use it. Now, you're in a historic district. I'm not quite sure who governs that. Rebecca, are you familiar? I think we need more familiarity with the exact situation.
Historic districts are, I think they can be either federally declared or state declared. So the State Historic Preservation Office is always a good spot to start, which you might not want to do because you're going to get the answer you don't want, right? But just remember that once you have that information, you may be eligible for other grant programs that you never realized could benefit that project. And a long-term ability for you to get to where you noted that it's more than the cost of or it's more expensive than the operating budget of the library. I think that's where you see people come together to figure out how to solve that problem. Legislators may find new money for you to get that project done. You may be eligible for other programs through the State Preservation Office or the Preservation League of New York State that you otherwise wouldn't have had access to without that ruling from the State Historic Preservation Office. But then there's also this moment, I know this is not going to make me very popular, but at some point, if that project is not affordable for you or your community, we have to reconsider the use of that building as a library. I've been involved with way too many projects where historic preservation has taken the front row seat compared to providing a library that met the needs of the community. At some point, we need to admit we're not in the historic preservation building as much as we want to be, and we want to honor that building and have it be as useful as possible in the future. Sometimes it's just not financially feasible. So I would say that's at the end of the line. I'm just gonna use my little train metaphor there, but I think you also are going to be eligible for a lot more funding opportunities once you have that answer.
Let me actually saw something just come up on chat that reminded me. I actually worked on a building project where it was too expensive to replace a slate, and SHPO wanted it done, and so the library rejected state construction, and they replaced the roof with, actually, I think it was reconditioned tires that looked exactly like slate. You could not tell the difference, and I believe there was somebody who mentioned Cahoes did something like that on the Q&A or the chat. There's other ways to do it, but you might have to forego a grant from the state, which may or may not. In that case, their case, it didn't even come close to covering the slate cost. It's an expensive project, and the people that do the slate, the closest people they could get were a group from New Jersey who had come over, and they had to pay to put these people up, and it was just not worth it. So there's other ways to do it. Sometimes you have to look the gift horse in the mouth and go someplace else.
Yeah, I think, Jerry, you touched upon it as well, is just bringing as many people together as possible to kind of think through that process. I worked at a library that had that slate roof, and we had that roof was there for 150 years before we even started experiencing any problems with it. So, you kind of have to also take a look at the longevity of that roof and how long it'll be around once you restore it or replace it with similar slate. So. So the next question comes from Stephen, and I really like it. It's going to take a little time for me to read through the context, but I think it'll answer a lot of questions for many trustees on the call. We have a shovel-ready project and have a meeting with our town supervisor and town board this Friday before proposing the project at our library's annual meeting and vote in April. So I'm assuming in a municipal library. Do you have any advice on how to prepare for the annual meeting from a building and grounds standpoint? What are the key talking points to mention to the public regarding our expansion? And Stephen wants to note that this is my first year on the board, so my learning curve is very steep.
Okay, I think we need some more information here. I'm assuming this is not a town library, but an association library that is funded by a town? because they said they have an annual library vote. And I don't know how they would do that if they were truly a municipal library. So, and they have an annual meeting as, if they're a municipal library, I don't know that they'd have an annual meeting. So that's one piece we're missing here. The second thing is, if it's an association library, I mean, we're not quite sure how they're funded. If they're having an annual vote on their budget, I would wonder why they're even talking to the town, other than to be courteous. They have their own funding stream. So be that as it may, the next question would be, are you voting this building project as part of your budget or as a second proposition? And then third question is, have you kept them informed all along? If you're just telling your town now, and then you haven't even told your community. Okay, those are my questions. Rebecca, maybe you can enlighten it even further.
I'm gonna just cruise past the fact that we don't have enough details to maybe
Okay,
nail this
thank you
one,
very
but-
much.
But I do want to hone in on what I think was part of Stephen's question, which is like, what are some key talking points when you're selling a project? Whether it be to a municipality that, has to bond for it, or to the community that's going to vote on it, or a funder who's going to, write a check out of their personal account. When you think about why you're doing that project, I'm going to be a broken record here, and going back to what the priority was. Why are you doing this project? It's not to, satisfy the strategic plan, it's to respond to community needs. So when we frame our messaging, we have to understand our audience and what drives them, what they're passionate about, what they will give money towards. So in an audience with a town supervisor, it may be the longevity of the building and a good return on investment, and making sure it's accessible to minimize risk. So the town won't be sued over the building that's not completely accessible. They're talking to the community at large. We're talking about inspiration of how we're helping people meet their needs in the community by investing in a new building that will meet the needs of our generational students who are going to succeed in our building. And we're talking big picture, right? When we're thinking about this. So talking points for a building should always demonstrate your good stewardship of the building, responsibleness when it comes to tax support for that building, but also inspire people to understand that how important your building is in the community and how the facility helps bring to life the delivery on the aspirations the community has for itself. So know your audience, talk about risk management. It's always a good thing to talk about accessibility because no one's going to argue with that one. If someone does, they're probably not necessarily that important in your community anyway. But I think that knowing your audience is really important, and really being true to the values of the board and the project will make a difference when you talk to the larger community about those things.
So I'm going to take Rebecca's lead and follow up a little bit more on that. First of all, if you're doing a building project, one of the very first things you woulda, shoulda, coulda, is you need to write a building program statement. Why, to go back to why, I love that. Why are we doing this? Before you even got an architect in the door, you should have had something to present to the architect. This is what we are looking for. This is why we need it. How are you going to respond to our needs? And not just one architect, but 5 or 6 or 7 or however. So you already should, the best projects have that homework done already. Before they go to the public, they did it internally. And then the next step, of course, is to keep the community involved in it all along. Now, just to digress a little bit, you're not the federal government. You don't get designers in and you figure out what you need and then say, that's what we're building. You're basically selling a dream, because you can't build it without the community support or a funder's support. So when Rebecca says, why are you doing this? You need to sell it. It's that simple. Yeah, I know, you can't tell people to vote yes, but you can tell people why you're doing it. And you can sell a dream of what the library means to the community and what the library will mean to their children and their grandchildren and their great grandchildren. And that's what you're selling. If you haven't articulated why you're doing this in the first place, as Rebecca said, that's tough. And it's awfully late to do it. So if you haven't done that already, hurry up.
Thank you both. As I appreciate you dissecting that question too, because as I read through Stephen's comments, I think you answered the two key questions that were actually within that statement. Our next question comes from Anne, and Anne wants to know if a library building is owned by the village municipality, who is actually in charge of the construction project, the library board or the village board? And one other question, the construction project mentioned is an extension to the building. Who's in charge?
Who owns the extension? Who's financing it? Bottom line is, if it's a village building and they're paying for it, it's their property. It's their building. It's, you know, and that said, and Rebecca has some great examples of municipal libraries that seem to have a lot more freedom. I'm not familiar with many villages that would give up ownership of the building project. They're the ones that are borrowing the money, financing it, and they'll build it. And unfortunately, sometimes they'll build it and halfway through they'll decide, well, yeah, you have a very nice meeting room here, but we're going to use it from now on. You know, it's their building. So unless you have a very good legal agreement with your village, and even if you do, forget it, they'll just break it anyway.
I was going to say, I like how we're continuing the theme of like the trials and tribulations of the municipal library in New York State, because there's so many different varieties of this. So is there a lease agreement in place? So you could have a municipal library in a municipal building, but there's a lease agreement that you're paying for that space, and you may have more control over it than not. If the ultimate landlord of that space is the village, and you need their permission to do a project, it might be a negotiation. I've got several libraries that have a municipal owned building. They could care less what the library did with it. And if the library made the case for the construction project and they were willing to go ahead and do it, the town has signed off on it for the library to do it. So unfortunately, I do think it varies on the very local conditions that you're confronted with, what the prior agreements have been, what's in writing already. And if there is nothing, which is often the case, there's nothing in writing, then it's totally the village's job and responsibility.
Yeah, Rebecca, I actually, one of the libraries that I expanded, part of the building was a village building, but the 100-year-old agreement, no, not quite 100 years, 80-year-old agreement was that the library managed it. And all of the village did was plow the snow. You know, they didn't fix the roof. They didn't do it. You know, they gave it basically they gave it to the library because the library was not a village library. It was not a municipal library. It was kind of a hybrid, but so it varies. But if they're paying for that expansion, they have every right to run it.
So many layers to municipal libraries. I feel like we have to offer up another session just on districting, because we talked about this in the after party when we talked about municipal libraries, and because there's so many layers, it just makes it so complicated to operate in that way. Just talking about facilities highlights that so much. So our next question.
Volunteer for Rebecca. We'll both do workshops on that until the cows come home. I mean, we just spent a good 2 years putting that new document together for the state on how to address that. So
the next question comes from Jennifer, and we talked about this during duties and responsibilities at the end of 2021. Could you touch on conflict of interest with board members when recommending contractors for the library? Oh wait, hold on, let me reread that. Could you touch on conflict of interest with board members recommending contractors when the library has a facilities manager and contractors that are doing the work?
is this a public library?
It does not say.
If it's just an innocent, oh, by the way, I know a great contractor that worked on my church or my, you know, that, and then they let it go at that. That's one thing. But if you're trying to get the job for somebody, it's time to resign from the board or recuse yourself. I think that's pretty obvious. Again, if it's a public library, that's a problem.
Jennifer clarified in the chat, they're a public library. So I think that, Jerry, that's where you were going to go, right? When you had that knowledge that they're public, you know, are you hitting the bidding thresholds where it's not a personal decision? You are putting that job out to bid and getting people to bid on that job. And maybe you have a trustee who recommends to someone they bid on the job. That person on your board needs to reveal any familial or financial relationship with that contractor before a decision is made. And they may have to recuse themselves from that decision if there's too close a tie to the business that's bidding on the job. I think for the jobs that fall under the bidding threshold, you have to be even more careful because there's not that transparency built into your process, perhaps. But again, having a really tight conflict of interest policy, the disclosure form for the conflict of interest policy to raise your trustees' awareness that they may need to recuse themselves when they have too close a tie to someone. And I think the full board has to hold themselves accountable if you have one trustee with undue influence over hiring someone that is a friend or a family member. The board needs to make sure the due diligence has been done to vet that candidate. Doesn't mean they aren't the right, company for the job, but you cannot be seen as playing favorites in the community. It will actively work against you.
Ryan's back.
So the next question comes in from Judy. This is my first time live, but I've watched all the other presentations. So I know it'll be no surprise to ask, as a municipal library, how are we shackled regarding the financials around these topics?
And our answer is, it depends.
I think we're going to spend another, let's do a whole session around that. I don't know where to begin with that. Your
So I think
stepchild.
the lowest, I don't want to say the most basic form of a municipal library would have the building completely taken care of by the municipality. They would be funding the upkeep of it, the maintenance, custodial services, plowing, any repairs to the roof, right? They would not be even part of the library's operating budget. But we have a spectrum of experiences of municipal libraries in the state where you can have everything from that, where you are in a complete custodial situation with I don't know if that word works in this situation, but a complete custodial relationship with your municipality, up to and including a completely independent municipal library that owns their own building and is completely responsible for it. So I hope everyone understands we are not avoiding answering these questions. There's just so many particulars. There's not one size fits all answers for municipal libraries in most cases.
Yeah, it depends.
It seems that historic preservation is our job. If our library is a historical building, do all ADA requirements need to be provided during construction? And this question comes from John. I know you guys talked a little bit about this on slides, but I think it's important to reiterate.
Oh, thank you so much for asking this question. I can't tell you how many times I've answered this question in the 20 years I've worked in library construction projects. You do not have a pass. You have to follow the Americans with Disabilities Act, even in a historic building.
And I would say your job is not historic preservation. Your job is providing a library service. And if you're also been gifted with an historic building, then that's another job as well. But your primary responsibility is to the community. And going back, we talk about historic preservation. SHPO, we sometimes misstate that term in the library field, but I do know a number of libraries that have wanted to plan to make their library, their historic library, accessible. And the state said, we're not going to fund you because you're, it's an historic, you can't do that. And they told the state that they can keep their money. And they did it on their own. And they did it tastefully, of course, but they made their buildings fully accessible because that's who they work for. They don't work for the state, they work for their community. And to have both an historic building that is accessible, that's a gift to your community.
I want to be clear, we are not anti-historic preservation.
No.
I mean, I think libraries and historic buildings are often in those buildings because they're located at the heart of a village, which means they're more walkable. You're preserving the fabric of the community and the cultural history of the area that you're in. And that may be, very closely aligned with the mission of a library to preserve local history. But there comes a breaking point at times in certain projects where the costs escalate and draw the attention of the board away from the governance of the library too far when they're going so far in on historic preservation projects for a smaller library, that there has to be that balance of understanding if it's detracting from your ability to provide quality library service. Sometimes very hard decisions have to be made.
Yeah, and I know we've mentioned this multiple times tonight, and as individuals that have all worked with SHPO in the past, SHPO is a fantastic organization to work with across the state. And the fact that, they've been involved in working with public libraries for almost decades now, they're really good at working with us and helping us understand, maintaining the historical integrity of the building, but also putting at the forefront ADA compliance and making sure all community members can enter our buildings. So I think that's also important to highlight. I have two more questions I want to make sure that we get to from our live attendees. The first one, and I know you guys are going to ask for more context on it, but it's not there, so I can't give it. But it comes from Aviva, and she does ask a good question because I know this issue exists. If the school holds the deed to the library, are they responsible for the facility? And we talked about this under municipalities, but so I don't know if this is a school district library or how this works, but if the school holds the deed, are they responsible?
No. If that would be a school district library, and the school district library is administered by the library board, The only reason the school district has title to the building is because they did the original bond. If that bond is paid off, the library could request to have the title transferred over to the library. Many don't bother because the next time they want to do a bond issue, they want the school to do the bond for them. And you can find the legal rundown on that is 260 subdivision 10, Ed Law 260 subdivision 10 for the school district is required to do the bond, but it might be owned by the district. And don't think of the district as a school board. Think of it as the district of the people who have pledged their faith and credit to pay off the building. So no, the library administers it completely as a school district library. There's just no question about that.
So I'll just put a little asterisk on Jerry's answer because there's always the outliers that there's definitely at least 2 libraries in the state where the school district owns the building and maintains it. Newburgh and Chatham are both controlled by the school district board as well as owning the facilities. So there's not to say, and that's why I just want to put that asterisk there. There's certainly outlier situations where, and I'm not sure where Aviva is from to answer that question, but I think
she's from Long Island. So yeah,
Jerry's answer is 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, and Newburgh is one of the very odd ones where the school board actually runs the library. It's kind of an odd situation. There are some ancient charters out there that are kind of weird, but
All right, so I'm going to go to a question that was actually asked earlier in the night, and I feel like this is a good question to end on because it'll hold us to doing some responsibilities or have homework assignments coming out of this meeting for all of us that are attending. But Leah asks, I wonder what other libraries are doing about the governor's cut to construction aid. Who may, and well, we'll leave it at that. What are folks doing about the governor's cut to construction aid? Rebecca and Jerry, you guys have been doing this a long time. What are things that we should be doing about that cut?
I'm going to let you guys are doing it these days. You're the one that got really a short end of the state budget stick this year. I was kind of astonished how bad that was. So I'll leave it to you guys because you'll be the political revolutionaries.
So 100% you are saying something about this to your elected representatives, your senator and your assembly person. They need to come tour your building, understand your needs. Photos need to be taken and shared. We were just doing our advocacy briefing for our members this afternoon. I said, take pictures, hold them up to the camera during our meetings. We need to tell the story of our facilities. And the challenge is so many libraries are operating under these days. The amount of money New York State puts towards library construction, I will say, is absolutely criminal when you compare it to what states like Massachusetts and Connecticut are putting towards library aid, and much smaller states are doing exponentially more dollar-wise than we are getting in New York. So telling that story, nothing is better than telling the story than having legislators walk through that building, having your patrons, so you don't love and invite patron complaints, right, about your building, but patrons who get it and understand their usage of your facility might be curtailed because of a problem with your building or a need that needs to be addressed. They need to contact their legislators too. So I think your legislators, your state senators, your state assembly people need to be well versed in the needs of your library, either for their ability to advocate for that money to be restored or for them to help you find other financing options through state sources. We've seen a lot of piggybacking when we do our advocacy visits as a system. libraries that speak up often get special attention from a legislator who will connect them with a SAM grant or find other special legislative funding that helps them in lieu of the state stepping up on the state aid for construction program. So legislators need to be well informed, motivate your base to advocate on your behalf on this one.
Yeah, I mean, just to put it in a more localized perspective, and this is what's happening within our system, and I know it's happening across the other 22 public library systems in the state. You know, we've got over $18 million in construction needs at the current governor's proposal. It'll take us more than 2 decades just to meet those needs based on what's allocated in construction aid. So yes, hopefully all of you are signing up for Advocacy Day. All of you are, you know, filling out your system's postcards or using NILA's platform to write to your legislators. Get out there and just raise your voices, because that construction aid is so important, and it's one of those programs that goes directly to our local libraries, and you know, it's our local libraries that really need to be advocating for it the most. So I want to just thank everybody for being here with us tonight. I want to thank Rebecca and Jerry for their continued expertise in the field of public librarianship. I'm glad that my internet didn't go out like my electricity went out here this evening multiple times. So we're having a storm here, so I apologize for that. But anyways, thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. If there's anything else you take away from this evening, visit our project's website at www.midhudson.org/trustee book club. You will find this session and all previously recorded sessions, along with the Trustee Handbook Book Club toolkits that you can use locally within your boardrooms to learn from each other and go through specific exercises. And then also make sure you're putting the next Trustee Handbook Book Club on your calendar. We meet again on March 29th at 5 o'clock, and Ron Kersap will be back to join us, and I look forward to moderating that session as well. So on behalf of everyone here on our planning team, Rebecca, Jerry, Casey, Ron, and myself, thank you everyone for being with us this evening. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Casey. And thank you, Rebecca, of course.
Thank you all. And thanks for the audience for being here and learning more.
Yep.